JLF's Brave New World welcomes you back to our second session of the day. Those of you who missed our earlier session, Good Omens, with Neil Gaiman and conversation with Nilanjana S. Roy, and all of our other sessions featuring stellar writers, including Chumpa Lahiri, Professor Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo, Anne Applebaum, Edmund de Waal, Kiran Mazumdar Shah, Neil Ferguson, Chikozi Obiama, Dr. Ambarish Sathwik, and so many others. You can watch them on our Facebook page, GLF Litfest, and on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest GLF. Our official radio partner is Red FM, Bajate Raho. Our next session of the day is The Lexicon of Love, Ruth Vanita and Sandip Roy in conversation. Ruth Vanita has done groundbreaking work on gender, sexuality, and women's rights. She speaks to writer-journalist Sandip Roy, author of Don't Let Him Know, about her evocative new novel, Memory of Light, on same-sex love in the last century. Together, they discuss the impact of inclusive literature and plural readerships in the context of their own work and the wider canon of LGBTQ narratives. Ruth Vanita is the author of many books, including Love's Right, Same-Sex Marriage in India, and A Play of Light selected poems, and her first novel, Memory of Light, has just been published. Sandip Roy is a writer, journalist, and broadcaster based in Kolkata. His novel, Don't Let Him Know, is now out in paperback. Please do remember to comment and ask questions by typing it into the comment section below. And in case any of you drop off due to bandwidth issues, you can find us on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest JLF. And in case we drop off, and I did earlier today, just hang in there and we will be back on JLF Litfest on Facebook. Ladies and gentlemen, the Lexicon of Love, Ruth Vanita and Sandip Roy in conversation.
Thank you so much, Sanjoy. And welcome to everybody to this edition of the Brave New World. We do indeed live in a very brave new world. And Ruth, you're halfway across the world from me. First of all, before we get into the book and all of that, welcome to the Brave New World. And how is it over there in your corner of the world?
Hi, Sandeep. Yeah, it's reasonably good. The wide open spaces, very few cases in the county, and generally.
You're in Montana, right? In the US, in the Rocky Mountains.
Yes.
Well, I'm glad that we can come together across geography, oceans, and time distances to talk about your wonderful new book, Memory of Light. For many of the people who are watching and listening right now, already know Ruth Vanita because of many groundbreaking books she's done, which Sanjoy talked about before. But I should say, like, sort of personally for me, I've always be indebted to Ruth because it was her scholarship, her research, her work that allowed me to see people like myself in my culture, in my skin, as it were, that you don't need to look for role models of queer or LGBT or gender non-conforming identities necessarily in San Francisco or New York or London, that they have existed for time immemorial in our world as well. And we'll talk about some of the non-fiction work that is that you uncovered there. But we'll get to your book right now, which is just out, Memory of Light. When we think of gay or LGBT and India right now, Ruth, we invariably think of Section 377. That is like the thing that sort of defines our lives, post 377, pre 377, during 377. But your book is set in a particular period of time, which is before 377 even came into existence in this country. This is a time when the Mughal Empire is on its last legs. The British Raj is starting to gobble up chunks of India. And in the middle of this, you set this love story. Was there a reason why you decided that this particular historical moment was where you wanted to set this love story?
This is the book, just to show the cover. And the reason was that I had been researching that world, and that world had captured my imagination. And I also had a love story to tell. And I wanted to explore how a love story would unfold, a love story like this between two women would unfold in a world, in a society where there wasn't the same kind of social disapproval as developed later after 1857 and after 377 and the whole century after that. I just wanted to see what it would be like, what would be the same, what would be different. And also, as I said, that world was sort of alive in my mind. So that was
Well, the world was alive in your mind because of a lot of the work you had done. But when you were growing up in India, did you think about these issues in terms of like what could this have been possible in Indian history? Were in Mughal periods or pre-Mughal periods, what could have same-sex love looked like? Did you know this? Because you didn't have a same-sex history of India, which you and Salim Kidwai did as your reference, as people do now.
When I was growing up, I didn't think much about it at all. I just thought of love as love. I didn't have any language or any words. And when I did find the words when I was 18 to 20, over 20, I began to read. And what I picked up whatever I could find, which was mostly Western literature, but one or two Indian things. So it was to educate myself that I started reading everything from the Mahabharata onwards that I could lay my hands on and where I could, which was accessible to me. So.
And do you remember the first time you found some instance of something that might have been queer in reading about reading through our own texts?
I think one of the things that really struck me was in 1980 when I read in the newspaper about these two young women who had attempted joint suicide in Kerala. And I started collecting the reports of these young women totally outside any movement these women were. They were low-income group, non-English speaking, who were running away and either committing joint suicide or getting married, or both. And this has been going on over the last 40 years. And this was my book, which is just, the updated edition has just been released, where I've given a list of the names that I have, which is, of course, not complete. So I think that was the first, like, really startling thing to see what women are doing elsewhere on their own. How do they find this language? They knew no word like gay or lesbian or anything. There was no international movement for gay marriage, and yet they were deciding to get married. So I thought that was fascinating. Yeah.
You say in this new edition, you put in the names as many as you know. How many names are there?
It's the ones that I have, it's about, I forget, but over 200, 250, I would say, something like that. Yeah.
Over
but this
200,
is the tip of the
250
iceberg.
names.
Because it's basically the English language press and a little bit of the Hindi language press. If you look at all the regional languages and all of Hindi language press, it'll be much more. So.
Wow. And this is something, and of course, these are the ones that have been picked up. Many of the cases, people die and you're never told the reason that they have killed themselves,
Or they have run away and got married and are living together. There are also marriages where the families actually supported the marriages. From 1987 onwards, we have those. So
that's so interesting. In your book, for example, in this novel, your new novel, Memory of Light, you tell the story of Nafis Bai and Chappala. And these are two women. One is a sort of a poet, or an aspiring poet. The other is a dancer. They meet in a kotha in Lucknow at a certain time in the 18th century. The King George's 50th birthday celebrations are being planned all over India, and there's dancers are rehearsing for it and stuff. It's a very evocative setting. But was there also a reason why you chose to set this in the milieu of a kotha? Because was it because women in the kotha, I mean, it's a women-centric world there, and women there had more agency? Is that part of your reason?
Yes, absolutely. These were women who had who earned very high incomes. They were owned property. They were in the highest income tax bracket as women in their own names. They also lived in an all-women sort of a world. They were men, but they were living downstairs in the same house. And so all the relationships, whether they're friendships, their quarrels, their rivalries, their love affairs, these are going on. A lot of them are between women. Also, these women had significantly greater freedom than perhaps other conventional women to interact with men, not just to have love affairs, of course, but also to have friendships. And Nafis has friendships with several men where they can converse freely about a number of things. So, and that's a rare thing that very few women had at any time. So women, Tawaf, so courtesans also traveled much more than other women, like in groups, but still they traveled widely to perform and so on. So it was, that I like that.
And you said they had higher income. So how did that translate, in terms of income and property? How do we know this?
We know it from the records, the historical records. For instance, the women performing at court in the early 19th century in Lucknow, their salaries are recorded at something like some of them. A lot of women were performing, so not just as dancers, as all kinds of things, singers, servers of pan, etc. So there were hundreds of them employed, and a lot of people from outside Lucknow came there to be employed. And this is not, I think, unique to Lucknow, though there are unique elements to it. And they were earning some of them were earning something like 300 rupees a month, which was the budget for the entire state hospital. So it's a very high income. Plus, of course, they had other patrons and friends who were giving, and lovers who were giving them gifts and expensive gifts and things like that.
It's interesting while reading the book, where I was thinking the way you depict the love story between these two women. It's secret, sort of, but in a way, all love stories are often secret, whether it's between people of opposite genders or same gender. I mean, the whole delight of a love story is that it has to be kept secret. If it's all public to the world, it's an advertisement, not a love story.
Exactly. You got it. So secrecy is not only about hiding from social disapproval. It's also about the pleasure of when you are still exploring it. You yourself don't quite know what it is. You don't want to announce it yet because you're not ready. That's what it is. And one of them also has a girlfriend in another town, so she's hesitant about the whole thing. So yes, I wanted to look at what is similar across time and place too, in the hesitations of love and the uncertainties of it, and the imbalance. It's very rare that both love equally, right? So equally intensely, and there may be a moment of that, but how long does that? So those were some of the things that I was looking at. Yeah.
And the other thing is that it's sort of secret, but it's not entirely secret to the people around them. People have some inkling of it, some more than the others. There are people they confide in it. So can you talk a bit about this Western notion that we have inculcated now about gay love as the forbidden love, and this idea of homophobia, and how, I mean, at one level, we don't want to paint an entirely idyllic, rosy picture of the past where, same-sex couples were painted and lauded. But at the same time, this is not the kind of Judeo-Christian Western homophobia that we have been taught to expect.
Well, one has to remember that at this exact time in which I have set the story, a lot of poets, Urdu poets in Sharangin, who are characters in my novel, were openly writing about all kinds of love, male, female, male, female, female in the same tone. And they were very popular and famous poets. They were not unknown. At the very same time, Byron in England was changing the pronouns of his love poems from he to she for publication, because it was practically a death sentence, and certainly an exile sentence from England if you were found to be what we now call gay, right? So that was the difference in Milo. There is a distinct difference. Also, there were lots of words, some of which I use in the novel, but not all, and rituals for establishing female couples. These words are in the dictionaries, like chapti and dogana, a woman's close, intimate female friend who may be a lover, is dogana, which means my other self, the double. I have one of the poets recorded this ritual where two women exchange cardamoms, ilaichi, and then they are called each other's ilaichi. And he says they are known as married among their female companions. Okay, and
oh my God, that's like Shubh Mangal Zada Saavdhan. This took that idea from there. There's a whole ilaichi exchange there too.
Yes, somebody in that film did a lot of homework and did read up a lot. So the exchange of ilaichi, the exchange of chicken bones, there were various things you could exchange to become a couple. Women did, and there were words for that, zanaki, guiya, and some of these words are still in use in the late 20th century. In the 1970s, chapti is still there in Hindi fiction. Guiya
what does chapti mean?
Chapti means chipatna, to cling or stick together. So two women who stick together are known as chapti. Some of the poets wrote poems called Chapti Nama about this phenomenon, about two women who are in love. And Chapat Baz was a woman who is like, Kabutar Baz is somebody interested in pigeons, Londe Baz, somebody interested in boys, Patang Baz, somebody interested in kites. Chapat Baz is a woman who is interested in chapti. So the words and the lexicon, the terminology was there at a time when in England it was literally, had been for centuries, unspeakable, the sin not to be named among Christians. In India, it was never unspeakable. You could approve, disapprove, celebrate, write about it. But from the Kama Sutra onwards, it's not at all unspeakable. So it's always spoken about until this changes after in the mid 19th century. And by the 1920s, it has become kind of unspeakable. So in India.
But while it is not unspeakable, there's also, for many people, the expectation of marriage is still strong as a social thing. And so it's not also like people don't necessarily are not that fazed by the idea that somebody who is married can also have a same-sex lover on the side.
No, and not just a same-sex lover. Men, for instance, for men, for many men, I shouldn't say for all men, it depends on the sector of society. For many men, you had to get married, or almost all had to get married and have children. After that, you are free, along with that, to have relationships outside. That's what the whole courtesan institution is. You have long-term, short-term relations with women. You can also have with men. So men were much more free. For women, it's conventional women, it's in the family, it's less free, but they could have relationships within the family, within friends, within neighbors, in the domestic world. Courtesans are kind of a crossover because they also have a space in the public world and the private space. So.
Now, as you mentioned, in your book, you weave in the stories of real life poets and their poetry into this world. But for example, for these characters, the two main women is there any allusion to anyone like them that you had found in the poems that sort of sparked either Nafis or Chapla for you?
I got the name Chapla Bai from a poem, which I translate a bit of it in the book, that Insha wrote on the 50th birthday celebrations of the king. He says Chapla Bai stood up to dance. And then he describes her head to foot and her intelligence and her wit and her beauty and her dancing. He doesn't tell us anything about her background. So I got the name from there, and I actually described her dress in the same way on that occasion. The rest of it I made up. Nafis is entirely an invention. Yeah, but Insha, Rangeen, Jurrat, these are real life poets. I took a lot of the anecdotes of their life from their own writings and other people's writings. And then, of course, dialogue and so on. I made up the relationships with the women. I made up the details of that. But yeah, the story of Hazrat, the man and the woman, the man who has a relationship with the courtesan and the lady in charge of the courtesan objects to it, Hazrat and Bakshi. That's a real story written at great length by Jurrat. And apparently they were real people. He says they were his friends. So that was taken from there. But then, of course, I changed certain things and wrote it.
So when you were reading these people's stories, what were the attitudes towards same-sex love that you could find in the poetry or all the diaries and accounts that people kept of that time?
There's only one literary reminiscences autobiography that Rangeen wrote, but the poetry basically and some of the prose attached to the poetry. Yeah, it's they write about male-female love and female-female love and male-male love in the same set of tones. So it goes from everything from amused to sad to romantic to playful to funny to everything, the whole range of things. Sometimes they even pick up lines from one poem that's about two women and transfer it to a poem about a man and a woman. So clearly they don't see a great deal of difference. And as I said, this poetry was very popular and very fun, and I've translated some of it. So they don't seem to find it a problem in that way. And it's not explicitly sexual, but there's a lot of sexual detail, very suggestive erotic detail. Like there's another poet whom I barely mentioned, where he says, one woman speaking to another, where she says, all night my hands were devoted to you, and the next morning I felt so devoted to my hands. So that's very evocative. It doesn't tell you exactly what the hands were doing, but it's left to you to imagine, right?
Which is always the most exciting.
Yeah.
Actually, do you want to read a couple of lines from one of the poems that you used in the book, just to give people an idea? Yeah.
Okay, let me see. Okay. झिलमिली सी चादर महताब ऊपर बर्ख का, वो दुपट्टा बादले का था जो लहराया किया। यूं लगा मालूम होती हैं ये दो परियां बाहम, एक ने गोया की साया दूसरी पर आ किया। बुए गुल बोली कि आज आपस में बदली ओढ़नी, चांदनी खानम ने बीच चपला से बहना पा किया। So a shimmering veil of lightning over the moon, a cloudy veil of fine fabric fluttering. They seemed to me two fairies close together. Fairy was the word pari, was used for
Sorry.
beautiful, any beautiful person, but especially courtesan. They seemed to me two fairies close together. One drew near, cast her shadow over the other. The flowers' perfume said they have exchanged veils today. Lady Moonlight has become Lady Lightning's sister. So the word chapla does appear there. Chapla means lightning. Chapla, be chapla, Lady Chapla. And Chandani Khanam. So I made Chandani the pet name that Insha gives to Nafis in the book.
So how fun was it? Like when you were doing, the book, like an earlier book, when you were looking at the actual instances of same-sex love that we found in our literature, you had to stick to the text. You had to stick to what you found. You could not make up stuff. How fun was it for you as a writer to be able to do these things right now, where you have text, you have facts with you, but you can make up, you can color in the romance as you wish as a fiction writer?
Well, yes, it comes from it's a sign of trying to meld one's own experience, other people's experiences together, and memory. And I have dreams, then there memories, dreams, letters, life, etc. And it's as you said, fun, but it's also kind of scary. It's sort of making yourself vulnerable in a different way than scholarly work does, and what might be recognized, what might not be, and just the whole. Also, I didn't know if the writing was any good because I know how to judge my academic writing, but this writing, until I showed it to someone, I didn't know if it was working. So it was a very a new process, sort of an adventure, and it sort of opens up another side of the mind, another side of consciousness that isn't expressed in scholarly work.
So when you said it makes you vulnerable, were you afraid people would try and look for Nafis or Chapla in Ruth or try and map your life to their story?
Maybe a bit of that, but mainly I think vulnerable because you're opening up emotions, your own emotions, when you're writing about this, and you're opening up a side of yourself that is not visible in your scholarly work or your teaching. That way vulnerable.
Yeah, that emotion is a very interesting, and I want to talk. There's a line in the book where where the poet is telling them, "No, Pyari, you're too busy thinking of union these days, but separation is the real thing. Ever heard of the Chakwa and the Chakwi who long to meet at night? They're separated by the river Jamuna. You're an innocent. You know nothing about passion." And I thought, that is. To talk a little bit about that as a time when we approach this idea of same-sex marriage and legalization of marriage and normalization and mainstreaming of this, which are all wonderful and laudable goals. Are we also, in a way, moving a little bit away from what you call stolen wine is sweet, the poets say? As someone said, what is good politically might not always be, what is good for politics is not necessarily always good for art.
I don't think there's any contradiction, and it's the same for if you're talking about a man and a woman. I don't think there's any difference there either. Love and marriage are two different things, and marriage it may include love, but it's a different type of love. But the intensity of love in those first 2 months or first 2 years at maximum, that's a different thing. And that's never going to go away. So having a right to get married is one thing. But from ancient times onwards, from Tamil Sangam poetry, from Sappho onwards to the present, love and loss and exploring that is what most poets worldwide write about, right? And because that's something that you get married, you have a life, but that intensity of that love, that memory stays in your mind, resurfaces in dreams, etc. So that's what you write about, right? There are many more poems about love than there are about marriage.
And in a sense, do you think it's pointless to try and capture that, like, while everybody wants a happily ever after story for their love affair, sometimes perhaps young love is best left as stolen love, because the happiness of a happily ever after can never match that intensity of passion?
don't know. I wouldn't. There's most people have more than one love, for one thing, right? As even Nafis does in their life, and then love changes. If it lasts, it changes, as it does between Nafis and Chapla. It may become friendship. It may become marriage. Marriage is a kind of friendship, as I've argued in my book on marriage, and friendship is a kind of marriage. So it changes, but the love that is lasting, that is sustaining, that you have when you're 70 years old is a very valuable thing. I don't want to discount that. So they do different things. There's the brevity and intensity, which is so intense that you remember it because it is ingrained into your mind, burnt into your mind. But there's also this lasting love without which you can, which lengthens people's lives, which is your everyday food. It's the difference between bread and wine. That's the difference between water and wine.
But have you found instances of in our poetry or text talking about that kind of love, that kind of lasting love, which is more than the fleeting passion of the courtesan that I've glimpsed at a dance?
Yes, I've written about this in some 14th century Bengali texts, in fact, about two women who are actually married to a man. The man dies and the two women continue to live together. They're kind of connected to each other in a kind of marriage. They're co-wives. And then they have a relationship. And then by a miraculous fiat from above, one of them becomes pregnant and they have a child. So they are living together, they are loving together, and they now are parenting together. So yeah, we do have that. It's a very rare text. I haven't found an equivalent in any other culture, and I have really looked, of two women physically producing a child together. So there's that. There are many other real life stories. There's a story of two poets, I think in the 18th century, two male poets, where one of them dies and he leaves all his property to the other. They were living together, and the other one then actually keeps the mourning period that a Muslim widow keeps for her husband, that period for this man. So yes, there were many long-term relationships that are recorded. When Havelock Ellis, I don't know if I didn't mention it perhaps, but Havelock Ellis in the early 20th century asked somebody in India to tell him about same-sex relationships, and he was told about two widows who were living together, two women in prison who were living together. So he was told about actual relationships that were long-term ones. Yeah.
Wow. So when you were researching the earlier book, which looked at same-sex love in our history and culture, what struck you the most about the kinds of same-sex stories that emerge, about how the Indian canon developed differently from the West?
Right. That is this book, and it's being an updated edition is being issued this year. And this book also an updated edition. These are the updated covers. That book was a remarkable. The whole thing has been an educational experience for me. The fact of same-sex desire was never mentioned, even in school and college when we were taught. Even people like Whitman or Dickinson or whoever, E.M. Foster, or whatever. So it was an educative experience to discover this, which was right there in print. It wasn't hidden away. This wasn't about digging things out of anywhere. It was right there. These were famous writers. So from the Mahabharata, the Kama Sutra, these Bengali texts I mentioned to you, to Urdu poetry. And I learned Urdu in order to be able to read this poetry in which women are speaking to and about women. Male writers are writing, but the female voice. And then a lot of 20th century material. So it was a discovery process. It's still a discovery process. I still discover things every day, new things that should have been in the book, but are not. And so it's...
And when you, but as you said, none of that existed. This whole was a process of discovery for you. How did you guys think that there might be enough here to warrant a book, because you don't know what is out there?
Well, just on the premise that we know that same-sex desire is human and it exists in every human society. And then India has millennia-long history of written work, a huge body of written work. It can't be that you have such a body of written work without this being one of the things written about, as about many other things. So we knew it was there. It was just a matter of reading widely. And of course, we don't know all the Indian languages. So it was a matter of asking other people for the languages we didn't know, where we often succeeded and often did not succeed. But in the languages we knew or we had some access to, it was just a matter of reading a lot. So when we started out, I think we knew of only a very few things. Firaq Gorakhpuri, Amrita Shergill, hardly anything, right? But when I started reading, I kept finding. I read all the Purans, I read the Mahabharata. It took a long time, but yeah. So.
What was one of the most exciting things that you found, that when you discovered it, you felt a real thrill. Your Indiana Jones moment.
I think the Bengali and Sanskrit text produced in Bengal in the 14th century about these two, there are various versions of the story of Chandra and Mala, these two co-wives who are married to King Dilip, and after he dies, they fall in love and they produce this child. That was an extraordinary find. And also the Rekhti poetry, because I kept finding, at the time when I was doing it, I had to go to and find it in manuscripts. The printed editions had all gone. These poets had been removed from the canon because of, not just because of this, but because of their racy tone in general. And so I had to go to libraries and copy out by hand with a very suspicious librarian sitting there and staring at me. and he would try to read over my shoulder. Fortunately, he couldn't read it because 18th century writing is very different. Even I had trouble getting to learn it. So it took a while. So I had to copy this out by hand in pencil from the manuscripts. And it was a revelation. It really is a revelation when you read this. So it's worth all the hard work. It's amazing.
For all the young people out there, you know that these things didn't come easy. People had to do very old school ways to uncover these texts. I wanted to invite people to send in questions or whatever for Ruth or about this. But since you mentioned racy, one slight small quibble I have with your book, even though I found it. So it was so beautiful and so poignant. I thought that, as a story set in such a rich time period, I wanted a little more sex.
Somebody else also asked that. That's just my predilection, I guess. The poets didn't write about explicit sex. As I said, they wrote about things but I think the best poetry that they've written, sometimes they do have some explicit mention of a body part. Most of the time they don't. And I stayed with that tone. And the mechanics of sex there's nothing particularly new about that. It's the emotion that is new and different hopefully between people. And it's that I do have a description of a kiss, which I think is pretty
you do.
But apart from that, I think it's best left to the reader's imagination, and that every reader will be different.
They can fill in the gaps.
There's things that are not to be, for me, are not to be. Like when you're eating, you describe the food and all that, but you can't totally describe what the taste is like, right? That has to be left to the imagination, can't be described.
We have a question from Rachita Akhilesh Chauhan, and Rachita asks, while you're coming of age, especially in urban middle class, there's a lot of stigma with exploring one's sexuality. Everything boils down to the family's reputation. History tells us it wasn't always like this. When did this start? And especially for India, is this an import? And a sort of a related question from Om Prakash Parekh says, when and how did sex become a taboo in Indian society? This is the land of the Kama Sutra.
Indian society is such a huge term, and it's such a huge country, and there's such vast differences. It's impossible to generalize. So I don't want to make it out, as you said, that it was ever this free land and everybody was, though the Kama Sutra says everyone should read it, including women. I don't think, obviously everyone was not reading it. At the same time, I would say that in the groups that did read and that had access, and those are the groups that make public opinion. And I would say that marriage was near universal, but outside marriage, there was room, especially for men to explore and for women within the domestic world and for courtesans. But in literature, when did it become unspeakable and when did it become such a taboo? I think that is only after British colonization, really after 1857. So anti-sodomy law comes in Section 377 in 1861. And not only that, but not only the legal change, but the change in education, the change in administration, the change in attitudes. And I don't think it's only about same-sex love at all. It's about sex in general, and it's about pleasure in general. And I've written about this also. It's about the relationship to pleasure. Is it all right to write just about pleasure, or is it all right to live just for pleasure? In the modern world, we tend to be very didactic, and I think there's a Victorianism to this didacticism. The literature is worth something only if it has a message, if it's going to change the world, for example. Modern Americanism, everything is about changing the world. That was not, I think, an earlier Indian attitude. There's your business to go out and change the world. So that you can live for pleasure and not for work, that the first question you ask someone is not what do you do. The whole worldview changes. And I think also the attitude and connection to rang and ras and color, especially for men, but for everyone. That men's, at a certain point in the 19th century, educated urban men stopped wearing cosmetics, stopped wearing jewelry, stopped wearing bright colors. And this might seem like a small thing, but I don't think it is. I think it's a major shift in consciousness that happens, and it may be shifting back now. But yes, it's a Victorian attitude to pleasure and play that the British, to some extent, get over somewhat earlier, and that modern Indians take longer to get over because they imagine that it's an Indian thing, but it's not really. It's an import.
We have a question from Rohit who says, what are your comments on the representations of LGBTQ characters, their problems and issues raised and discussed in Hindi cinema? For all we now living in the age of Ek Ladki Ko Dekha and Shubh Mangal Zyada Sabdhan, you know. At one point 20 years ago, when you and I first perhaps met, we wouldn't have imagined that films like this would show in a mainstream theater. You know, for us, LGBTQ cinema was small indie films.
Quite true. But then on the other hand, the regular Hindi films were always loved by a lot of LGBT people. And that is, I think, because their focus is so much on love, on giving up everything for love, however socially disapproved that love may be, one thing. And one very distinct characteristic of Indian cinema, Bombay cinema, is the very close same-sex romantic friendship and love between men. And you can think of hundreds of examples. We'll eat together, we'll live together, we'll die together, as the Sholay song says, right? You don't get more romantic than that. So as I said, hence the point about sex, that who was having sex when and how in the past, we can't really say, but who loved whom, you can say. And I think love between men, not so much between men, but between men in Bombay films is very evident in a way that is absolutely not evident in Hollywood, for example, or other cinema. And yes, Shubh Mangal Zyada Savdhan I thought was wonderful because it wasn't didactic. It conveyed a message, but it still was very fun. It was within the grammar of Bombay cinema, and a great film, I thought. Mm-hmm.
Was the scene with the two women in the boat that you have in your book, where they're floating down the boat, was that a little tip of the hat to Razia Sultan?
No, not really. It was gotten from an anecdote where Insha and Rangeen were seen floating down the river with one's head in the other's lap, and so I thought they could meet on the river. So the two women in the boat was my addition. The two men in the boat was
already historically there.
A very good scene in Razia Sultan.
I was reminded of that scene. Nayana Barbarua asked, what do you think about the readership in India regarding books on same-sex love? Do you feel that the readership has grown in recent years now that many people are now openly supporting LGBTQ rights? We asked this at a time when your older books are being reissued.
Yes, I think it's become mainstreamed. A lot of writers who are not identified as gay have written about same-sex relationships, like Manju Kapoor, that married woman, right? There's a relationship there, and many others. They have either a minor or major relationship. So I think it's become part of fiction.
Do you think that matters? Some people are like, why are they writing our stories? We're still writing our stories.
Absolutely. Everyone should write any story they want to. I don't believe that one can only write about oneself. Then if one could only write about oneself and one's own group, I totally disagree with that, that only an Indian can write about Indians. Vikram Seth wrote a great book set in California where there's no Indian character. So the imagination cannot be restricted like that. And if you only write about yourself, you'll end up only writing a diary. And even then you can't mention other people in the diary. So I don't agree with that at all.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, if I could only write about my experience, it would be very boring indeed. Most of us don't lead such, exciting lives. We have two questions, one from Ria and one from Kriti, which talks about a sort of earlier incarnation of yours and asks you, what were the biggest challenges when you were running Manushi, and in terms of the era it was launched in and how you view the world today.
When we were running Manushi, I guess our biggest problem is we had no money. There was no funding available for NGOs in that time. And we also didn't want any funding. So we were basically funding it with our salaries and with our tremendous amount of labor. So I was teaching to support I was teaching in a college, but every other spare moment was spent doing basically what I call donkey work, addressing envelopes and things like that. Plus, of course, editing and proofreading and in an age when there were no computers. So that was our biggest problem. We had a lot of support from people. I have to say that even in a very low middle class neighborhood where we lived in Lajpat, all the local people said, oh, they are doing work for women and they are sacrificing their lives for it. It's such a great thing. So until their own daughters or daughters-in-law got involved, then they were, then they had doubts. But otherwise, there's this great respect for anyone who's doing what is seen as social work. So, yeah.
In terms of coming back to the book and some of the issues people have been talking about, do you think that in a time where there is greater visibility of these issues, that it is still going to be a huge struggle to make lesbian stories visible? Because, I mean, I don't think it's an accident that gay stories, gay activists come to the forefront again and again. Shubh Mangal is a gay story also. And at the same time, you know, we have so many documentations, as you've talked about, of lesbian suicides. You know, women, in a way, women have borne the brunt of both homophobia and patriarchy in much more than gay men have.
Well, the women who committed suicide, I do want to emphasize that a large number of them also got married. There are wonderful stories about women who married and lived for 20 years together, and then their whole village demands that the legislator fight for equal rights for them. There are these two women in Assam, whom I wrote about. So there is that too. So there are success stories too. There's also Der Ishkia, which is a wonderful film. So I think as far as women and men are concerned, it's about that men live more in the public world as in the past, and they can be married and have with their family, but not tell their family, and then lead a completely different life outside, which some women can do, but fewer women than men can do that. So that hence the sort of struggle to get married, which is, say, for these young women, because that's a way of declaring that I do not want to marry a man, right? That's one thing. The other thing is that in writing and literature, I think it's a tendency for reviewers to focus on gay male stuff, even when the female stuff does exist. For example, a lot of writers will say, oh, so-and-so, some man was the first gay writer in India, which is not true. One of the earliest writers was Suniti Namjoshi, who was absolutely open from the late 70s and 80s onward, right? She wrote some absolutely stunning work like Conversations
with a Cow, yes.
Where she just shows women together, but also men together in Mothers of Mayadeep. And this is wonderful work, but it's not as widely known as it should be. It is so then I think much lesser work done by men much considerably later. So it's also about where we look and what we look for. Yeah.
We're almost out of time, unfortunately, but let me try and squeeze in one question from Ava and Pranati, which looks to the future and asks you, do you think we can reach a stage where children can grow up with queer relations being normalized, and how?
Yes, I hope so. It's happening in many countries. The change of the law is a big step in that direction. Getting civil rights will be the next struggle. Equal civil rights as citizens will be the next struggle. And I think visibility in the media is very important for children to have many films in which gay characters appear just as part of regular life and on TV, in books. So all these things. And then, of course, knowing that there are people who are living a life as a gay person is very important. So many celebrities coming out, more of them coming out, more just your next door neighbor, anyone will make a huge difference. It'll take a lot of time. It'll take time. I can't say how much time, but I'm sure that it will happen. Yeah.
Well, I think that's all the time we have right now. So I want to thank you so much, Ruth, for talking about Memory of Light. And I want to hand this over back to Sanjoy for its concluding remarks.
Thanks, Sandip.
Thank you. Thank you both so much for that wonderful conversation. And what better way to celebrate Pride Month, in fact, but with this particular conversation. And so much of what you said, Ruth, in terms of writing in the 70s and Manushi, and brings back wonderful memories. And thank you, Sandip. That was absolutely brilliant. And thank you all for watching. And I'm sorry we couldn't stream all of the questions as usual. We've again run out of time, and I promise we will send some of them out to Ruth and to Sandip to perhaps, if they agree, to write, and we will post them back on Facebook. We thank our official radio partners, Red FM Bajate Raho, and please do remember to log in next Wednesday, the 24th of June, for another set of great sessions at the new timing. We've got Shobha Day speaking of her new ebook, Lockdown Liaisons, where she examines the changed emotional and social realities of the pandemic. And here she speaks of intimacy in times of quarantine as she discusses her new work. And this is at 7 p.m. IST, 2:30 p.m. British Summer Time, and 9:30 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. And the second session is Anubhav Sinha's Article 15 with Vani Tripathi Tikku. Anubhav Sinha talks of the idiom, metaphor, and language of film, a heart-to-heart conversation on his cinematic career, his convictions, and the future of the cinematic image. And this is Wednesday, the 24th, 8:30 p.m. Indian Standard Time, 4 p.m. British Summer Time, and 11 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Be safe. We'll see you on Wednesday. Tomorrow is an eclipse, so hang in there. If, as the Mayans have predicted, the world doesn't come to an end, we will be back with JLF's Brave New World on Wednesday. Bye-bye.